Can I sit here? 4 words, spoken by a bald little girl with a teddy bear. And in that instant, a man who had everything, except healing, remembered what it meant to be alive. The cafe sat at the edge of Harvard Square, dressed in its usual winter hush. Snow clung to the corners of windows. Steam drifted from ceramic mugs. Outside, boots crunched on old brick paths. Inside, the world held its breath. James Carter sat by the window, alone as always. To the world, he was a man made of glass and gold, 37 years old, founder of Lydian Tech, listed on Forbes' top 20 innovators under 40. A mind that reshaped data encryption, a bank account with too many zeros, and a silence that never left him. He wore a charcoal coat and a scarf, woolen, soft, old, too small for his frame. It once belonged to his son, Ethan Jr. The waitress, a girl from Tufts who didn't recognize him, set down his black coffee without a word. He nodded, then returned to his view, the empty chair across from him. He always chose a table for 2, and always sat alone. That's when he heard the voice. "Excuse me." He looked up. There she was, a little girl, 4 years old at most, bald, pale, cheeks red from the cold. She held a teddy bear tight against her chest. Her mittens were mismatched, her boots too big. Her voice? Steady, clear. "Can I sit here?" James blinked, startled. She didn't wait for permission. She climbed onto the chair and hugged the teddy bear with a sigh, like she'd found a familiar friend. "My name's Sophie," she said. "This is Hope." She held up the bear. "She's a doctor." James nodded slowly. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Hope." Sophie giggled, then coughed. A deep, scratchy sound that made James's stomach tighten. "I like sitting by the window," she said. "It's warm here. Also, you looked sad." He swallowed. "Did I?" She nodded. "Your eyes are sad, like my mommy's when she thinks I can't see." James studied her. There was something about the way she looked at him, not as a stranger, but as someone familiar. And then it hit him. The eyes. That wide-open wonder, that careful tilt of the head. It was exactly how Ethan Jr. used to look at him when he didn't understand something but wanted to try. Without thinking, James loosened the scarf from his neck and held it out. "Are you cold?" Sophie's eyes widened. "It's pretty. It's yours." She wrapped it clumsily around her tiny neck, then beamed. "Now I look like a grown-up." He smiled. A real one. The first in months. "Are you here alone?" he asked. Sophie looked toward the counter. "Nope. Mommy's getting tea. She gets scared when I talk to people. But you looked nice. So I came." A woman appeared just then, brown coat, too thin for the weather. Grace Miller. Her face, when she saw Sophie sitting across from a strange man, turned to panic. "Sophie!" she gasped, rushing over. "I told you to stay close!" "I was warm here," Sophie replied innocently. "And Scarf Man is nice." Grace's eyes flicked to James, guarded. "I'm sorry," she said. She's friendly with everyone." She reached to lift Sophie from the chair. "She's fine," James said gently. "She just saved me from a lonely morning." Grace froze. For a moment something passed between them. Hesitation, recognition, distrust, and something softer. Still, she nodded stiffly. "Thank you for being kind. We'll be going." Sophie clutched her bear, still bundled in the scarf. "Bye, Scarf Man," she chirped, waving as Grace led her out. James watched them go, a sharp ache in his chest. He hadn't spoken to a child in 2 years, not since the accident, not since Ethan and Lily were taken from him. But something about that little girl, and the mother who looked so tired and strong at the same time. He sat back. His coffee had gone cold. Outside, the snow fell heavier. But inside, for the first time in years, James Carter didn't feel entirely frozen. He touched the table where Sophie had rested her mittened hands, then reached into his coat pocket. A drawing. He didn't know how it got there. 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one small, all holding hands. Underneath, scrawled in purple crayon, "Scarf Man, me, Mommy." He closed his eyes, exhaled, and held the picture to his heart. The hands of the clock above the espresso machine ticked softly in the background, always a little off from real time. No one bothered to fix it. The cafe had grown used to its quiet imperfection, just as the man who now returned to the same corner table had grown used to his own. It was 9:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. James Carter stepped into the cafe without glancing at the menu. He didn't need to. Everything about this place had etched itself into his morning routine. Except now, that routine included scanning the room for a small, bald girl with a teddy bear. She hadn't come back. Not yet. He sat at the same table by the window, wrapped his hands around his cup of black coffee, and waited. Each day since Sophie had sat beside him, something unfamiliar had begun to settle in his chest. Not pain. He knew pain too well. Not guilt, though it always lingered. It was softer. Stranger. Hope, maybe. That day, as he stirred his coffee, James thought again about the drawing she'd left in his pocket. Scarf Man. Me. Mommy. He had placed it on the mantel at home, next to a photo of Ethan Jr., as if somehow those 2 fragments of childhood belonged together. He didn't know why he kept returning. He only knew it felt necessary. Thursday, 9:45 a.m. Snow flurried in again. A couple of students huddled in the corner over textbooks. A businessman shouted into his Bluetooth near the door. James sat. Waited. No Sophie. Saturday, 9:45 a.m. The bell over the door jingled. He didn't look up right away. He didn't want to disappoint himself again. But then he heard it. Scarf Man! He turned. Sophie was running toward him, arms open, her teddy bear trailing behind like a cape. She launched herself into his lap with the ease and ownership of a child who believed entirely in her welcome. And in that moment, James's frozen world broke open again. "Dr. Hope missed you," Sophie announced, holding up the bear proudly. "She said your coffee is too sad without us." James laughed, a full, warm sound. "I missed you too." Grace followed a few steps behind, more composed than last time, though still cautious. She wore the same coat, but her eyes were clearer now, less defensive, more uncertain. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," she began, hesitant. "She kept asking about you all week. I figured one visit couldn't hurt." "It's not inappropriate," James replied, his voice quieter now. "It's good to see you both." Grace nodded and sat across from him, adjusting Sophie on the bench beside her. Sophie immediately began decorating the table with sugar packets, napkins, and her bear. "You've made this your office, I see," James joked. "Dr. Hope likes a clean space," Sophie replied, utterly serious. Grace gave a small smile. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was cautious, like two people feeling the edges of something fragile. I brought her because... Grace paused, searching for the right words. She doesn't connect with people easily. Not since... She trailed off, then gestured slightly to Sophie's scalp. James nodded. I understand. She had a bone marrow transplant last year, relapsed in September. Grace looked down. We're trying a new protocol now. It's intense. A lot of side effects. Hair loss is just one of them. James's hands tightened around his cup. I'm sorry. Grace looked at him again. The thing is, she hasn't let anyone but me hold her since she got sick. Not doctors, not nurses, not even my sister. But she climbed into your lap like she's known you forever. James didn't know what to say. She calls you Scarf Man, by the way. You left quite the impression. Sophie suddenly perked up. Do you want to see what I drew? She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and slid it across the table. James opened it carefully. It was another crayon drawing. This time, the three stick figures were in the cafe. One had a red scarf, another had curly lines for hair. The smallest one held a teddy bear labeled Dr. Hope. Above them in purple letters, Family Cafe. His throat closed up. Grace leaned in. She doesn't understand who you are. She just trusts you. James looked at her. That might be the best thing I've heard in years. For the first time, Grace really studied him, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a man sitting alone with his grief tucked neatly behind a cup of coffee. You lost someone, she said quietly. James didn't flinch. My wife, Lily, and our son, Ethan Jr. Grace blinked. Car accident. 2 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light. Sophie had gone quiet, listening with wide eyes. Since then, James continued, I haven't really talked to anyone under 4 feet tall. Grace whispered, and now she won't stop talking to you? He gave a soft chuckle. I guess she broke the rules. No, Grace said. She made a new one. They stayed for almost an hour. Sophie colored. Grace sipped her tea slowly. James answered every question Sophie asked, from why the snow is white to why people sometimes cry when they smile. Before they left, Sophie reached into her small backpack and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. A small bear. His name is Teddy Hope, she said solemnly. He's your doctor now. James held the stuffed bear in both hands. He hadn't cried in years, but now he nearly did. Thank you, he whispered. Keep him by your bed, Sophie instructed. He makes nightmares go away. Grace stood, touched. Say goodbye, sweetheart. Sophie leaned in and kissed James's cheek. We'll come again, right, Mommy? Grace hesitated, then nodded. Yes, baby, we will. James watched them disappear into the snowfall once more. But this time, the emptiness didn't return. On his table sat the newest addition to his life, a crayon drawing and a tiny doctor bear named Hope. The cafe clock still ticked, slightly off. But for once, James didn't mind. The lights in the oncology wing glowed soft and golden, like they were trying to pretend this wasn't a place where battles were fought every day. Grace sat quietly on a plastic chair outside Sophie's treatment room. Her hands were clasped tightly around a lukewarm paper cup of chamomile tea. Her eyes tracked the IV pole like a hawk, as if watching the clear fluid drip into her daughter's veins could somehow protect her from the poison it carried. Inside, Sophie was sleeping. Dr. Hope was tucked beneath her arm, one ear sticking out from under the blanket. The room smelled faintly of alcohol swabs and artificial lemon disinfectant. A nurse walked past and offered Grace a sympathetic smile. She didn't smile back. She didn't have the energy. That morning, the hospital's billing office had called. Again. Grace had ignored it. Again. She'd been putting off the next round of payments for 3 weeks. The hospital was merciful, up to a point. But the debt was beginning to tower. She had sold her car, let go of her freelance PR clients, downsized to a one-bedroom rental, and still, it wasn't enough. Grace pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. The screen loaded slowly like it knew she was bracing for impact, checking $84.17. She swallowed. Then came the email. Subject line: Your payment has been processed, Massachusetts General Hospital. Her breath caught. She hadn't authorized anything. She hadn't made a payment. She clicked it open. Amount: paid. $47,826. Paid in full. No balance remaining. Her vision blurred. She stared at the numbers, willing them to make sense. She scrolled down to see if it was a mistake. And then she saw the name. Payer. Mr. James Carter. The cup dropped from her hands. Tea splashed across the floor. That evening, as the sky dimmed over Boston, Grace stood outside a brownstone in Beacon Hill, her fists clenched in her coat pockets. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it wanted out. She rang the buzzer. A familiar voice answered. Yes? It's Grace, she said, sharp and cold. We need to talk. A pause. Then the door buzzed open. James was in the foyer when she arrived. He looked surprised, then concerned. Is Sophie all right? She's sleeping, Grace replied. Unlike me. He gestured toward the living room, but she didn't move. Did you think I wouldn't find out? She asked. James's jaw tightened. I didn't do it to be found out. You paid nearly $50,000. That's not a gesture, James. That's a takeover. I didn't mean to offend you. Well, you did. The quiet that followed was cold and crackling. James stepped closer, his voice measured but honest. I know it was over the line, but I also know what it's like to watch your child's life depend on a number you can't afford. I've been there. Grace stared at him, arms still rigid. This isn't about money. It's about dignity, autonomy. You didn't ask. You just decided. I watched my son die because I hesitated, because I thought I had time. I didn't want to watch someone else lose their child just because of paperwork. His voice broke slightly at the end. Grace froze. James turned toward the fireplace mantel and picked up a photograph. He held it out. Ethan Jr., 5 years old, wearing a superhero cape, mid-laugh, frozen forever in that moment. I was supposed to pick him up from daycare. Lily was running late. I had one last call to finish. Just one. He shook his head. By the time I got there, they were already in the ambulance. Grace took the photo, her hands softer now. I'm not trying to replace him, James said, or fix something I can't fix. I couldn't sit by and watch it happen again. Grace looked at the photo again. The boy's eyes were the same as Sophie's, brighter but carrying that same open trust. I understand that, she said finally. More than you think. But what I can't live with is being seen as some project you can rescue. James's voice dropped. You're not a project. You're the first person in 2 years who's looked at me like I'm not made of glass. That stopped her. I came here ready to scream, Grace admitted, ready to walk away. Then why didn't you? She looked up at him, really looked. Not as the man who paid her hospital bills, not as the billionaire, but as the man who sat in a cafe at the same time every morning just to see her daughter's face light up. Because Sophie would never forgive me. James smiled faintly. And because, Grace added, her voice barely audible, I saw the drawing she made. The one with the three of us holding hands. It scares me how right it feels. James's eyes softened. Then maybe we don't run from it. Maybe we just stay still for a moment. Grace stood in silence, torn between pride and gratitude and something she didn't yet have a name for. Eventually, she turned to leave, but at the door, she paused. She wants to see you tomorrow, she said. Same time, window seat. He nodded. I'll be there. Before she stepped outside, she glanced back at him. Next time, she said, if you want to help, ask me first. I promise. And she was gone. But the drawing remained, taped now above James's mantel beside Ethan Jr.'s photo. A simple sketch of 3 stick figures. A family. Maybe not by blood, but by choice. The first sign came from the barista. James had just walked into the cafe 5 minutes earlier than usual. The wind outside was sharp, slicing across Harvard Square like a scalpel. His scarf, the one Sophie had worn that first morning, was now folded gently in the crook of his elbow. He planned to return it to her today, with something else tucked in the pocket, a tiny red mitten he'd found under the cafe table a week ago. But something was different this morning. The barista, a girl with blue hair and kind eyes, didn't smile like she normally did. Instead, she paused as she handed him his coffee, then said carefully, Hey, I didn't know you were working on rebranding. James blinked. I'm not. She tilted her head. Oh, it's just, you're kind of everywhere this morning. That's when he saw the paper. It was folded on the counter. Boston Globe. Headline page. The billionaire, the bald girl, and the single mom. Rebuilding a reputation or finding a soul. Below it, a grainy photo. James sitting at the cafe window, smiling at Sophie, who was reaching across the table with her bear. Grace, blurred in the background, handing Sophie a napkin. James stared at the page, stunned. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the cardboard sleeve crinkled. Grace was already on her way to the hospital when the phone started buzzing. At first, she ignored it. Sophie had had a rough night and they were running late for her blood work appointment. She was half-dressed, coaxing the little girl into a jacket when the 4th call came in, this time from her old college roommate, now working at a PR firm in Chicago. She answered on instinct. Grace, what the hell is going on? Excuse me? You're on the front page of the Boston Globe, with your kid and James Carter. Are you two dating? Is this some kind of launch? Grace froze. What are you talking about? Do you seriously not know? I'm sending the link right now. Check your email. Grace opened it. The headline hit her like a slap. A tech titan's second act. Inside the quiet coffee dates that melted the Ice King's heart. She dropped the phone. By the time she arrived at the hospital, she was shaking. Nurses smiled at her differently. One whispered something behind a clipboard. Another offered her a free muffin for the little miracle girl. Grace felt like she was underwater. Every sound muffled, every face slightly distorted. She knew this world. She used to build it. Back before Sophie's diagnosis, Grace had been one of the most respected mid-tier PR strategists in Boston. She could spin a scandal into a second chance with just 3 interviews and a charitable tie-in. She recognized this headline for what it was: a narrative, a pivot, a move. She didn't wait. She pulled Sophie's hood back over her head, apologized to the nurse, and headed straight for James's office. James was at Lydian's downtown headquarters when she stormed in, past the confused assistant, past the stunned receptionist, and straight through his office door. He stood up the moment he saw her. "Grace, you told me you didn't want to use us," she said. Her voice trembled, but it was cold, not weak. "I didn't," James replied. "Then why the hell are we on every news site in Boston?" "I don't know," he said, stepping toward her. "I didn't leak anything. I haven't spoken to a reporter in weeks." Grace tossed the newspaper onto his desk. "They used our names. They used Sophie's name." James scanned the piece. He read faster than most people breathed. "I swear to you, I didn't authorize this. I didn't even know it existed until this morning." Grace's arms were folded tightly across her chest, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. "James," she whispered, "this is the exact kind of story I used to pitch. I know what this is. It's a strategic leak." He looked up at her, stunned. "From me? From my team?" "Maybe not directly, but someone saw us. Someone took that photo. Someone thought turning your grief into branding was the move." James ran a hand down his face. "No one on my team would have done this without asking. You're James Carter. You pay people to clean your image. This is classic damage control. The CEO who lost his family, now reborn through a sick child and her struggling mother. It writes itself." Her voice cracked on the last word. James moved to the window and stared out over the Charles River. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that promised snow without delivering it. "You think I planned this," he said quietly. "I think—" She paused. "I think I wanted to believe you saw us as people, not redemption." He turned to face her. "I don't need redemption, Grace. I need peace. And for the first time since I lost my family, I found a sliver of it. With you. With Sophie. Then why does it feel like you're rewriting our story without asking?" James said nothing. Grace swallowed hard. "We can't be in your spotlight, James. She's too fragile. I'm too tired. And I won't let Sophie become a symbol in someone else's campaign." She turned to go. "Grace, please." She paused, her hand on the doorframe. "I didn't ask for money," she said. "I didn't ask for headlines. All I ever wanted was a life quiet enough for Sophie to heal." Then she walked out. And this time, James didn't follow. The article spread like ink in water. Other papers picked it up. Morning talk shows speculated about James's emotional turn. Twitter declared Sophie the bravest girl in Boston. Hashtags trended. But Grace went silent. She didn't return to the cafe. She stopped answering texts. The window seat stayed empty at 9:45 a.m. James didn't return either, because without her there, the seat didn't matter. He sat at his office desk late into the night, staring at the headline again and again, wondering who had taken that photo, wondering who had spun their quiet miracle into spectacle. And more than anything, he wondered if Sophie still wore the scarf. Boston had never looked so cold. The wind that afternoon cut straight through layers. It yanked scarves off necks, flipped umbrellas inside out, and scattered dried leaves down empty sidewalks. People hurried past one another without speaking, their eyes lowered, their hands stuffed deep into coat pockets. But in the middle of that busy, wind-chased world, a child stood alone. A small girl. No hair. No adult nearby. Her boots barely reached the yellow line of the curb. She was hugging a stuffed bear with one arm, and in her other hand was a crumpled piece of construction paper, purple crayon, fading under the sharp sunlight. A drawing of 3 stick figures, a red scarf, and underneath, in crooked letters, Scarf Man, Me, Mommy. Sophie Miller waited for bus 56. It had been exactly 8 days since Grace and James last spoke. 8 days since the article dropped. 8 days since Grace packed up their mornings and chose silence instead of uncertainty. To Grace, it was necessary. She had to protect Sophie. But to Sophie, it was a betrayal. She didn't understand why they stopped going to the cafe, why Scarf Man was now a name that made her mother's voice go tight. She'd asked 5 times. Each time Grace had said, "We're just taking a break." Sophie didn't want a break. She wanted her family back. Grace had fallen asleep on the couch that afternoon. She hadn't meant to. A night of fevers and nausea had left them both exhausted. Sophie climbed off the bed quietly. She slipped into her puffy coat, put Dr. Hope into her backpack, grabbed her drawing from the fridge, and left. The bus stop wasn't far. She remembered the number James once pointed to when they watched the buses go by from the cafe. 56, he'd said. That one takes you near the park. So she waited. And waited. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard with her crumpled $2.50, paid the driver with practiced confidence, and took a seat by the window, just like always. No one asked questions. No one noticed how small she was. No one noticed that she didn't have an adult. Grace woke with a jolt. "Sophie?" No answer. She checked the bed, the bathroom, the kitchen. Nothing. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She opened the front door and screamed into the stairwell, "Sophie!" Still nothing. Then she saw it. The front gate slightly ajar. The space where her daughter's boots had been, empty. She grabbed her phone and dialed the only person whose name made sense in that moment. James was in a board meeting when the call came. He saw Grace's name and immediately excused himself. It was the first time he'd heard from her since she walked out of his office. Her voice was frantic. "Sophie's gone. I woke up and she was just gone." James didn't hesitate. "Give me 10 minutes. I'll find her." He didn't say try. He said will. And for the first time in over a week, Grace let herself cry into the phone. The search was frantic. Grace called every hospital. James called every cafe. They pinged police dispatch. Grace gave them a description, holding back sobs as she tried to explain that her daughter had no hair, no coat lining, and a stuffed bear named Hope. Meanwhile, James made his way toward Boston Common, a quiet instinct guiding him. He remembered what Sophie had said that day in the cafe. "The birds at the park say good morning to me." He parked illegally, ran 3 blocks, and there, under a wide-branched elm tree sitting on the bench by the carousel, he saw her. Tiny boots, a red scarf around her neck, and Dr. Hope nestled in her lap. She was staring out at the water fountain, shivering slightly. He ran. "Sophie!" She looked up. Her face broke into the biggest smile. "Scarf Man!" she squealed, hopping down from the bench. She ran to him, full speed, and threw her arms around his waist. Her tiny fingers clutched the lapel of his coat as if she were holding on to the last familiar thing in the world. "I missed you," she whispered into his chest. James closed his eyes and held her tighter than he had ever held anything in his life. I missed you too, Sophie. He knelt down to her eye level. Why did you come here, baby? She pulled out the crumpled drawing. Because I wanted to go back to the family cafe. James's heart cracked. She added, Mommy was sad, and I thought if I found you, she wouldn't be. He picked her up. You are the bravest little girl I have ever met. And he meant it. Grace arrived 10 minutes later. When she saw Sophie in James's arms, safe and smiling, she collapsed onto the nearest bench in relief. Sophie, she whispered, tears flooding her eyes. Sophie reached out. Don't cry, Mommy. I found him. James placed Sophie gently into Grace's arms. I'm so sorry, Grace whispered. You scared me half to death. Sophie nodded seriously. I didn't mean to. I just wanted the picture to come true. She held up the drawing. James looked at Grace. Her mascara had run. Her cheeks were red, but her arms were full, and her heart was whole again. She loves you, Grace said softly. I think she always has. I love her too, James replied. More than I knew I could. They sat together for a long time, watching Sophie chase pigeons through the breeze, her scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon of red hope. For the first time, Grace didn't feel the need to pull away. And for the first time, James didn't feel the need to hide. Later that night, back at Grace's apartment, James stood by the doorway as Sophie fell asleep clutching her bear. Grace touched his hand. I overreacted, she whispered. I just got scared. So did I, he said. But not of headlines. I was scared I'd already lost you both. She looked into his eyes. Then let's not lose each other again. And they didn't. Snow fell like ash over Beacon Hill that Friday evening. The wind pressed against the windows of James Carter's brownstone, rattling the panes, whispering through the narrow cracks like old ghosts begging to be let in. Inside, warmth flickered from the fireplace, but the rest of the house, though grand, modern, and spotless, felt strangely hollow. Until now. Sophie's boots squeaked against the marble tiles as she darted inside, giddy from the ride in James's Tesla. This place is huge, she announced, spinning in the entryway, arms stretched like airplane wings. Grace followed behind her, soaked from the sleet, eyes cautious as she took in the pristine space. I told her we were only staying the weekend, she said, while the medicine stabilizes. 1 night, 2 at most. James nodded. Whatever you need, both of you. She took off her coat. This is temporary. James smiled gently. Of course. But in his heart, he wished otherwise. They'd made the decision in crisis. Sophie's immune system had crashed 2 days earlier. Her new treatment, a more aggressive protocol, caused her fever to spike to 104. Grace had rushed her to Massachusetts General. Sophie's breathing was shallow, her body trembling uncontrollably. James had shown up at the ER without being called. He'd brought a private pediatric specialist, held Grace's coat as she cried in triage, and sat outside the ICU with both hands gripping Dr. Hope like it was sacred scripture. When they were finally discharged, Sophie still fragile and pale, James offered quietly, My home is 5 minutes from the hospital. The top floor has filtered air, backup power, a private elevator. You can take the master suite. Grace hesitated, but then Sophie leaned her head on James's shoulder and whispered, Mommy, can we stay with Scarf Man just until I feel stronger? And that was the moment Grace said yes. Now, standing in the hallway, James bent down beside Sophie. Want to see your room? She nodded, eyes wide. Does it have stars on the ceiling? No, James replied, rising with a smile. But we can change that. He opened the door. It was a room no one had entered in 2 years. The walls were still painted soft blue. A shelf of unopened children's books stood untouched. A set of dinosaur pajamas folded neatly in a drawer. A Lego spaceship frozen mid-construction. Ethan Jr.'s room. Sophie walked in slowly, as if crossing into a sacred place. She ran her tiny hand along the side of the bed. She paused at the nightstand and touched a framed picture of a boy with bright eyes and a lopsided grin. James said nothing. He simply stood at the threshold, his knuckles white against the doorframe. Grace stepped in beside him. "You sure about this?" she asked gently. He swallowed. "I think he'd like knowing she's here." Sophie turned, hugging Hope tight. "This room feels safe," she whispered. Like someone used to laugh in it." Grace blinked hard. James forced a breath. "He laughed every night. Loud, silly, belly laughs." "Then I'll do that too," Sophie declared, "so the room won't forget." And just like that, she climbed into the bed, as if it had always belonged to her. That night, Grace sat at the edge of the guest bed, soft, impossibly white sheets, a quiet room looking out at the snow, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her daughter was asleep upstairs, in the room of a boy who no longer existed, in the house of a man she barely knew. But strangely, it felt right. There had been no performance, no luxury traps, no expectations, only warmth and stillness, and the slow, steady cracking open of hearts. Downstairs, James stood in front of the fireplace, a cup of tea untouched in his hand. He looked around at his home, expensive, flawless, empty. He'd built this fortress to keep the world out. And yet, in 1 week, a little girl with no hair and a bear named Hope had barged in and set off fireworks in the dark. He climbed the stairs slowly, pausing outside Ethan's door. It was open, just a crack. Inside, Sophie was murmuring in her sleep. James leaned closer, one hand on the doorframe, and then he heard it, so soft he almost missed it. "Daddy." His breath caught. Not Scarf Man, not James. Daddy. He stepped back, pressed his hand to his chest, and for the first time since the accident, he allowed a tear to fall. Not from pain, but from the quiet, unfamiliar joy of being needed again. The next morning, the house smelled like oatmeal and strawberries. Grace was in the kitchen wearing one of his oversized flannel shirts over leggings, hair in a loose bun, sleeves rolled. "Hope you don't mind," she said, nodding at the stove. "She asked for something warm." James rubbed his eyes, still in a t-shirt and sweatpants. "I don't even remember where the stove was until now." Grace smirked. "You're welcome." They stood in the kitchen, mugs in hand, the early light pouring in. And for once, it didn't feel like a billionaire's house. It felt like a home. Later, as Sophie played on the living room floor with James, drawing, giggling, folding construction paper into scarf-shaped hearts, Grace watched from the couch. She saw the way Sophie leaned against him, the way James looked at her like she was sunlight in winter. And in that moment, Grace whispered something she never thought she'd allow herself to say. "Maybe," she said softly to herself, "we're not just surviving anymore." The city had begun to thaw. Snowbanks had receded into memory, leaving sidewalks lined with budding crocuses and hopeful daffodils. Children returned to playgrounds, cafes opened their windows, and the corner table by the window, once a shrine of grief, was no longer empty. Sophie sat there now, legs swinging from the chair, her fuzzy pink hat tilted slightly to the side. She was sketching something serious with a green crayon, tongue poking out the side of her mouth. Across from her, Grace sipped coffee, visibly more rested than she had been in years. The shadows under her eyes had faded. Her laugh had returned, gentler but full. James stood at the counter, greeting the barista by name. He wasn't the same man who had once hidden behind black coats and silence. Now he wore navy cardigans, smiled without effort, spoke with ease. When he returned to the table, Sophie held up her drawing. "It's you!" she exclaimed, pointing to a stick figure with tall legs, spiky hair, and a giant red heart. James grinned. "Why am I standing on a ladder?" "You're reaching for hope," Sophie replied matter-of-factly. Grace choked on her coffee. "I stand corrected," James said, placing a kiss on Sophie's forehead. "That's the best thing anyone's ever said to me." Sophie smiled. "I want you to build something big, like a place for kids like me, and moms like Mommy. A place with toys and doctors, and blankets, and pancakes." James leaned back, thoughtful. "What if I told you we're already doing that?" Sophie blinked. "Really?" He looked at Grace. "I wanted to talk to you both today, because it's time." Grace tilted her head. "Time for what?" James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. On its cover, a logo, Sophie and Hope Foundation. The O in Hope was a crayon heart. "I've registered the foundation. Fully funded for 10 years. Mission: support single parents of critically ill children. Housing assistance, hospital grants, therapy programs, educational care, even emergency transport, all under one roof." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "James." He opened the folder. "I want you to run it." Silence. Then, "Run what?" "Everything community-facing," he continued. "Outreach, family liaisons, storytelling campaigns. You know that world, Grace. You lived in it. You understand it better than anyone. You could lead it with integrity." Grace shook her head slowly, stunned. It's everything I used to dream of. But, she glanced at Sophie. "What if I'm not strong enough?" James took her hand across the table. "You've carried a daughter through chemo, homelessness, and heartbreak. And you're still here. That's not weakness, Grace. That's the definition of strength." Sophie piped up. "Can we have a Dr. Bear in every room?" James laughed. "I'll have our lawyers draft the Teddy Hope Clause immediately." 2 weeks later, the doors opened. The Sophie and Hope Foundation occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a brick building near Boston Children's Hospital. It didn't feel like an institution. It felt like a home. Murals on the walls, art tables instead of desks, a therapy dog named Watson, a reading nook with fairy lights, a cabinet filled with beanies for bald heads and tiny slippers for cold feet. Grace stood at the entrance, wearing a soft blue blouse and a name tag, Grace Miller, Director of Community Care. Her posture was straighter, her voice steadier. She no longer carried the weight of survival alone. She carried purpose. James watched her from the side, proud but quiet. Sophie, wearing a tiny blazer, tugged at the microphone wire as Grace gave her opening speech. "Before this place had walls," Grace told the room full of donors, nurses, volunteers, and grateful families, "it had a name, Sophie, and hope, and a man who believed that healing wasn't just medicine, it was belonging." There was a long silence. Then, from the back of the room, a small voice called out, "Mommy forgot the best part." Everyone turned. Sophie marched up to the podium, took the mic, and said proudly, "Thank you for saving my mom, too." The room erupted into tears. That night, James and Grace sat on the back steps of the building, overlooking the city lights. Sophie had fallen asleep on the beanbag chair inside, wrapped in a fleece blanket and clutching a clipboard labeled Head of Imagination Department. Grace leaned her head on James's shoulder. "I never told you," she murmured, "but I used to pray for a day like this. Not the building, not the money, just a day where I didn't feel like I was losing." James turned toward her. "You're winning now." She shook her head. "No, we are." A pause. Then she added, "Do you ever feel guilty for being happy again?" James nodded slowly. "Every day." "Me too." Another pause. "But I think maybe the guilt just means we remember what we lost, not that we don't deserve what we found." She reached for his hand and held it tight. They sat in silence as the city moved beneath them, alive and glowing. Two souls, once broken, now mending together in the soft light of shared purpose. Inside, Sophie stirred and whispered something in her sleep. "Daddy." Neither of them moved, but both of them smiled. Snow fell like silence. It swept across the roofs of Boston like a hush, covering traffic, softening city noise, and turning Beacon Hill into a Christmas card. Inside James Carter's home, the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. A tree sparkled in the corner, and stockings embroidered with 3 names, Grace, Sophie, James, hung above the fireplace. Sophie had spent the afternoon placing star stickers on every surface, from the piano bench to James's laptop. She wore a Santa hat too big for her head and a glittery red sweater that read, "Hope makes the best gifts." Grace had taken hundreds of photos that day. James had taken none. He'd only watched, quietly marveling at how full the house had become. But joy, as they'd both learned, is fragile. By 6:30 p.m., Sophie was on the floor, curled up beneath the tree, complaining that her stomach hurt. By 7:00 p.m., she was vomiting. By 7:30, she was burning with fever. And by 8:00, James was carrying her in his arms through the emergency entrance of Massachusetts General. "Her pulse is 143. BP falling. She's septic." Grace could barely stand. She clutched the side of the intake desk, shaking as they wheeled Sophie away. James had one arm around her, his other hand on the back of his neck, breath shallow, face ashen. Dr. Lerman, the pediatric oncologist on call, turned to them both. "It's a rare reaction to the new immunotherapy compound. We need to stabilize her blood pressure and start immediate IV antibiotics. She's going to ICU." Grace nodded numbly, whispering, "Please, save her." James didn't speak. He just took out his phone and made a single call to his private medical network. Within 20 minutes, a fully equipped pediatric team from Johns Hopkins was in the air, flying to Boston on his jet. Because nothing else mattered now, they sat in the ICU waiting room beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Christmas music played faintly from a corner speaker, off-key, out of place, almost cruel. Grace stared at the floor, trembling. Her hands were red from wringing them raw. Her voice had gone hoarse from crying. "She was just fine," she whispered. "This morning, she was dancing." James sat beside her, still as stone. "I know." "I should have seen something," Grace said. "I'm her mother. I should have known." James reached over and took her hand. "You did everything right. I didn't protect her." He turned to her, eyes rimmed with tears. "Grace, You love her more fiercely than anyone I've ever seen love another person. If love could have shielded her from this, she would never have gotten sick. She finally looked at him. She's all I have, she whispered. All of me is tied to that tiny little girl. I know, James said quietly. She's all of me now, too. Grace exhaled a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. She leaned into him, and for the first time, really leaned, head against his chest, breath shaking, heart breaking. He held her like the world might shatter if he let go. And in that moment, he silently promised God, the stars, fate, anyone who was listening, that if Sophie made it, he'd never ask for another thing in this life. The hours passed like centuries. The ICU monitors beeped and blinked. Nurses moved quietly like shadows. And then, just past 3:00 a.m., Dr. Lerman stepped into the waiting room. Grace stood. James rose beside her. The doctor gave a slow, tired nod. She's stable. Grace collapsed into James's arms, knees buckling. He caught her, held her, let her cry against his shoulder. She's going to sleep through the morning, Dr. Lerman said. You can sit with her if you like. They walked together hand in hand into the small glass ICU room. Sophie lay still, breathing slowly through oxygen tubes, her tiny hand curled around Dr. Hope. The monitor beside her beeped gently, regular now, steady. James pulled a chair to one side of the bed. Grace took the other. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The worst had passed. For now. Morning light broke through the blinds, soft and silver. Christmas morning. Sophie stirred. Grace straightened instantly. Baby? Sophie blinked, then whispered, Mommy? Grace broke down, laughing and crying all at once. Yes, baby, I'm here. Sophie's eyes fluttered open. Did Santa come? James stepped forward. He said you were on the strongest girl in the world list. Sophie gave a tired smile. And Dr. Hope stayed with me. You were both very brave, Grace said, brushing her hair gently. Mommy's so proud of you. Sophie's voice was soft but clear. Did Scarf Man cry? James chuckled, wiping his eyes. Maybe. She gave a satisfied nod. Told you he would. They laughed together, and though Sophie was pale, hooked to IV lines and barely able to speak, she was alive. That afternoon, back at the house, the tree lights blinked softly. Stockings remained untouched, but in the center of the mantel now sat something new. Sophie's hospital bracelet, tied into a ribbon, wrapped around a note that she'd scrawled shakily just before falling asleep again. I'm still here. Merry Christmas. And beneath that, love, Sophie, and Dr. Hope. The snow was long gone. Boston breathed again in sunlight. Shy tulips blinked open in window boxes, soft jazz floated through cracked cafe doors, and the sidewalks of Harvard Square bustled with students, street performers, and old friends returning from winter hibernation. But inside one small cafe by the corner window, time moved differently. It moved in circles, like the spinning spoon in Sophie's cocoa, like the swirl of her laughter echoing off the glass, like the memory of a little girl, bald and curious, once asking, Can I sit here? Now she didn't need to ask. She belonged. Sophie had changed. Her hair had returned, a soft copper-blonde fuzz that curled at the ends. Her cheeks were full again, laughter more constant, her voice stronger. She wore a red dress with yellow shoes, one of which was now dangling off the chair leg as she hummed to herself, legs swinging. Grace sat beside her, serene and glowing. Her face bore the kind of peace that only comes after long nights have finally passed. Her blazer was soft cream, her hands folded gently around a cup of tea. Her ring finger, bare. Not for long. James Carter stood by the cafe counter waiting for their order. But in his pocket, something small and bright waited for a different kind of delivery. They had come here together every Saturday for nearly a year. After the ICU night, after Sophie's slow but miraculous recovery, James had built a new rhythm for their family. Soft mornings, shared breakfasts, and this little corner seat by the window where it all began. But this day was different. This day he had something to ask. "Scarf man," Sophie called, waving both arms dramatically. "It's ready." James laughed as he returned, sliding the tray onto the table. "That's Mr. Scarf Man to you," she grinned. "You'll always be Scarf Man, even when you're 80. "Especially when I'm 80. They all laughed, but James's heart pounded. Grace sipped her tea. "It's hard to believe it's been a year." He nodded. "Feels like yesterday." "I still remember her asking to sit here," Grace said, eyes misty. "Just one seat, one morning, and everything changed." Sophie looked up. "Mommy?" "Yes, baby? Do you know what I want today?" Grace smiled. "Besides more whipped cream?" Sophie nodded. "I want to sit here forever." James cleared his throat, suddenly quiet. "Well, maybe that's possible." He stood up slowly, reached into his coat pocket. And then he knelt down. Right there on the cafe floor, right beside the table, by the same window where healing had begun. Grace gasped. Sophie's eyes widened. "Grace Miller," James began, voice steady but warm. "You walked into my life carrying hope in your arms and fire in your heart. You taught me how to breathe again. You let me love you and your daughter. And in doing that, you gave me back my life." Grace covered her mouth. "I've had many titles," he continued, "but the one I want most is husband, partner, and if you'll let me, dad." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, gold. Engraved within it, grace and hope. Grace's hands trembled. She tried to speak, but no words came, only a nod, slow at first, then stronger. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh my God, yes." James stood, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had always belonged there. Sophie jumped up and screamed, "I have a dad now!" loud enough for half the cafe to turn and smile. She flung herself into both of them, arms around their legs. James bent down to kiss her forehead. "You've always had me, kiddo. Now it's just official." They sat together, arms intertwined, laughter bubbling like spring. Grace leaned against James, her head on his shoulder. Sophie pressed her hand to the window, tracing a heart into the condensation. A quiet moment. A full circle. Then Sophie asked, like she had once asked before, "Can I sit here?" James looked down at her, his smile warm. "You don't need to ask any more." But Grace whispered softly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "She already did." And we said yes with everything we had. Outside, the wind carried petals down the cobbled streets like confetti. Inside, a family, whole, healing, chosen, sat by the window. And in one small cafe in Harvard Square, a new beginning bloomed like spring. The bench wasn't special. Wooden slats, iron arms, a slight squeak when someone leaned back too fast. It sat beneath a canopy of blooming dogwood trees, flanked by soft grass and dandelions, a few feet from the edge of the duck pond at Boston Common. Over the years, it had held joggers tying shoes, teenagers with guitars, retirees feeding squirrels, and lovers who didn't need to say much at all. Today, it held 3 souls who had walked through the fire and come out holding hands. Sophie raced ahead of them, her pink sundress fluttering in the breeze. In one hand, she carried Dr. Hope, now missing an ear and stitched twice at the belly. In the other, she waved a stale piece of bread, calling out, "Come here, duckies! Come have lunch!" Grace and James followed slowly, fingers intertwined. It had been 2 months since the proposal. 2 months of gentle planning, paperwork, doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and whispered prayers that somehow still hung in the walls of their home like morning light. And now, here they were, together, still healing, but no longer broken. James sat first, stretching his legs and sighing contentedly. "We made it through another winter." Grace chuckled, settling beside him. "You say that like you grew the daffodils yourself." "I might have. You haven't seen the backyard." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I have. You hired a landscaper named Miguel. He's a daffodil artist. Don't discredit the man." They laughed. Ahead, Sophie crouched near the water's edge, talking earnestly to a small duck with a limp wing. Grace smiled. "Do you think she remembers how close we came to losing her?" James shook his head. "No, but I think her body does. That's why she runs so fast, laughs so loud. It's like she's trying to prove to the world she's still here." Grace whispered, "She is." They sat in silence, watching their daughter feed the ducks. Yes, daughter. The adoption had finalized 2 weeks earlier. Sophie was now, in every way that mattered, Sophie Grace Carter. She had signed the certificate herself, her tiny handwriting wobbling, then had drawn 3 hearts under their names, 1 for each of them. They framed it. They put it beside the fireplace. They looked at it every morning like a lighthouse. Sophie ran back, cheeks flushed. "Mommy! Daddy! The ducks said thank you!" James grinned. "Did they say anything about the bread being stale?" "They said it was extra crunchy, like a Christmas cookie." Grace pulled her close. "You, my love, are a miracle." Sophie nodded. "I know." Then she asked, "Can I sit here?" James and Grace exchanged a look. Then James pulled her up between them, nestled her into the crook of his arm, and whispered, "You don't ever have to ask again." Sophie nestled in. Dr. Hope rested on her lap. The sun filtered through leaves above them, casting flickering gold across their knees. Nearby, a musician played a gentle tune on a violin. People passed, some glancing at the trio on the bench, some not. But no one could see the years they'd traveled to arrive here. The nights in hospital corridors, the tear-stained pillows, the first drawing of a family cafe. The scarf passed from one soul to another. The ICU whisper, "Daddy." The ring, Grace and Hope. And now, this. Just a bench. Just spring. Just 3 lives healed by one question, asked by a little girl with a teddy bear and too much wisdom in her eyes. Grace reached for James's hand again. "I used to believe family was what you were born into," she said softly. James glanced at her. "And now?" She kissed Sophie's head. "Now I believe family is who you bleed for, who you stay for, who you heal beside." He squeezed her hand. Sophie yawned dramatically. "Can we go get pancakes after this?" she mumbled. James kissed the top of her head. We'll get pancakes, waffles, and a chocolate milkshake if you promise to never grow up. Sophie giggled. Deal. And just like that, the bench became a memory. A safe harbor. A place they would return to, again and again, long after the ducks forgot their names. When the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows grew long, Grace whispered the words that had started everything. The words that once belonged to a frightened, hopeful little girl with no hair and a bear named Hope. Can I sit here? James smiled, kissed her gently, and answered the only way a man who had found his way back to love could. Always. Some questions seem small. Can I sit here? But they hold the power to open a home, build a family, and begin a journey of healing. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Thank you for listening to the pain, witnessing the hope, and smiling with us at a kind of ending we all deserve, a seat where you are loved without needing permission. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and don't forget to hit subscribe so we can walk together through more stories of healing. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in goodness. There's always a seat here for you, with us.